A frozen widow collapsed at his door at dawn, whispering, "Please don't leave us out here." The fire had been dead 2 hours when I heard it. Not a knock, nothing that deliberate. More like something heavy dragging itself along the outside wall than a sound I couldn't place at first. Breath, I realized. Ragged and too slow. Somebody breathing the way people breathe when they're losing the argument with cold. I'd been awake already. That wasn't unusual. Since Margaret died, since the fall of '82, I hadn't slept past 3 in the morning more than a handful of times. I'd lie in the dark and listen to the ranch breathe. The creak of the windmill, a horse shifting in the barn, the particular groan the north corner of the house made when the temperature dropped hard. I'd got to know those sounds the way you get to know a place when there's nobody left to talk to. Intimately, sourly. It was January. Bitter January, the kind that comes down out of the north like it has a score to settle. We'd had 9 days of it, below zero at night, not much better by noon, and a wind that found the gap in every wall and the hole in every coat. I had wood enough if I was careful. I had beef and cornmeal and a little coffee I was rationing. I had the dogs, Amos and Ruth, both old and arthritic and useless for anything but company, which was the only thing they'd ever been good at anyway. I was 58 years old. I want to be honest about that. 58 with bad knees and a left shoulder that hadn't worked right since a horse rolled on it in '79, and the kind of tiredness that isn't about sleep, the deep kind, the kind that settles into the chest and stays. I'd been running this ranch alone for 14 months. Before that, I'd been running it with Margaret, and before that, I'd been running it with Margaret and the 2 hands we could afford in the good years. And somewhere in all of that, I'd turned into a man who talked to his dogs at dinner and didn't notice until the words were already out. When I heard the sound outside, I didn't move right away. That's the honest account. I lay there for a few seconds telling myself it was an animal, a deer rubbing against the siding, maybe, something. Then I heard the voice. 2 words. Low and cracked, almost gone, like she was spending the last of something to make them. "Please." And then a sound I've never been able to describe properly. Not a cry exactly. The sound a person makes when the body simply stops being able to hold itself up. I had my boots on before I was fully standing. The coat was on the hook by the door and I got into it without stopping, and I pulled the latch and the cold hit me like a wall falling. That instant, total cold, where your face goes numb before you've taken a full breath. She was on the step, collapsed against the doorframe, knees drawn up, a child, a boy I saw, maybe 3 years old, maybe 4, pressed flat against her chest inside her coat, just his face showing. He was looking at me with the steady, strange calm that children get when they're past crying. She had an arm around him and the other arm was against the wall, keeping herself from going all the way down, but barely. Her face was wrong. The color of her skin, I mean, that grayish white that isn't cold the way cold looks when you've been outside half an hour. That's the color of a body that's been fighting for a long time and running out of fight. She looked up at me. Her eyes were dark, and even then, even in that state, they were clear. She said it again, what she'd been trying to say. "Please don't leave us out here." I said, "I'm not leaving anybody anywhere," and I got my arms under her. She was heavier than she looked, the way people are when they're not helping. The boy, he didn't let go of her. Even when I was pulling her up, he stayed wound around her like a knot, and I just lifted them together and got them inside. The fire was cold ash. I set her on the floor near the hearth. It was still the warmest place, residual, and I pried the stove door open and started laying kindling fast, not looking at them yet except to check the boy was breathing. He was. He turned his face into her neck and he wasn't crying and wasn't speaking, just holding on. She was trying to say something. I could hear her working at it. Later, I said, "Quiet, let me get this going." She went quiet. The fire caught on the 3rd match. I built it up faster than I should have. I know, you're supposed to warm hypothermia slowly. I knew that. Margaret had known everything about bodies and cold. But I was working on instinct, and instinct said, get the heat in the room. I got the blankets off the bed in the back. I got the boy loose from her. He didn't want to let go, and I didn't force it. Just talked to him low and steady until his hands relaxed. And I wrapped him first and then her. And I pulled the low chair up close enough to the fire that I'd have been nervous about it any other time. She had no gloves, her hands, when I uncovered them to check, raw, past chapped, past the ordinary damage of cold work. She'd been out in it a long time. "How long?" I asked her. She had to think, since a breath. "Before dark." I looked at the window, gray starting in the east. That was 8-9 hours. Where did you come from? She turned her head toward the north. That was all. But the Haverson place was 12 miles north, and nothing else was closer than 20 in that direction, and 12 miles in 9 hours in that cold with a child. I stopped thinking about it and got up to put water on for something hot. Her name was Clara Witt. Her husband had been Joel Witt, who'd run a small operation northeast of the Haverson land, 200 acres of scrub prairie and a mean stretch of creek bottom. I'd met Joel Witt twice, maybe 3 times, at the feed store in Dorado before it closed. A quiet man, dark-haired, younger than me. I hadn't known he had a wife. I found this out slowly over the course of that first day and the next, as she got warmer and more herself and was able to put sentences together. She didn't give it to me all at once. She gave it to me the way a person gives things when they're still not sure if they're safe, a little at a time, watching your face. Joel had died in October. Pneumonia fast. He'd been sick 3 days and then he was gone, and she'd been alone with the boy and the stock on 200 acres of hardscrabble land with winter coming. She'd made it to November, made it through November and into December with what Joel had put by, not much, but enough if she was careful. Then one of the milk cows died, then the other. She had the root cellar and the chickens and the last of the cornmeal, and she'd been stretching it. And then 9 days ago the cold had come down the way it did, that killing, particular cold. And it had taken the chickens in 2 nights. And after that, she'd done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had only one answer. Walk or don't make it. She'd been walking toward Dorado. My place was between her and Dorado, and I was closer. And when the boy couldn't go any farther, she didn't say it quite that way, but that's what she meant. She'd stopped at my door. She told me all of this plainly, sitting in the low chair with her hands wrapped around a tin cup. The boy, his name was Eli, asleep in the back bedroom under 3 blankets. She told it without asking for anything. No setup, no plea. She told it the way a person reports a fact. When she finished, she looked at me steadily and said, I didn't know where else to go. You went the right place, I said. She nodded once slowly. She was still gray, still worn down to something essential, but the eyes were the same as they'd been on the doorstep. Clear, watching. I'll need to know what you want me to do, she said. When the weather breaks, I'll need to work for what we've eaten. I opened my mouth. I mean it, she said. I'm not a charity case. I've got good hands and I know stock. Just tell me what you need done. I closed my mouth. I thought about it. My fence lines a wreck on the south quarter, I said. She nodded. I can do fence. We sat with that for a moment. Clara, I said. The weather's not breaking for a week at least. You don't need to figure anything out right now. I know, she said. I just needed you to know. She slept for most of that day and the next. Real sleep, the deep and helpless kind, the kind the body takes when the emergency is over and the bill comes due. Eli slept 2 long stretches of it, and when he woke he was quiet and watchful, and he watched me from across the room with those careful eyes. I cooked what I had. Cornmeal mush with a little salt and the last of a venison roast I'd put up. Coffee for her, weak but hot. I didn't have much that was worth eating, but I put what I had on the table. And on the second morning when she came out to the kitchen and saw the food laid out, she stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite name. You didn't have to do all this, she said. I had it, I said. She sat down across from me and we ate, and she didn't talk much and neither did I. Which was the first time in over a year that the silence at my table felt like something other than an accusation. Eli ate methodically, both hands. He was a deliberate child. He'd pick something up and look at it before he put it in his mouth, like he was making sure it was what he thought it was. He had his mother's eyes, dark, direct, making assessments. On the 3rd morning, he climbed up into the chair beside me without being invited and watched what I was doing. I was mending a piece of tack, just keeping my hands busy. And after a while he said, What's that? That's a headstall, I said. Goes on the horse's head. Why? So you have something to hold on to. He thought about this. Why do you need to hold on? So the horse knows which way to go. Another long pause. Doesn't the horse know where it's going? Sometimes, I said, not always. He seemed satisfied with that. He picked up a short piece of the leather I'd trimmed off and turned it over in his hands. That night Clara found me on the porch. Cold but not killing cold, and the sky was clear, which meant another hard freeze but at least no new snow. She stood beside me and didn't say anything for a while, looking at the same dark I was looking at. "He talked to you today," she said. "He did. He hasn't talked much since Joel." I didn't say anything. "He asked me tonight if you were going to make him leave." Her voice was even reporting. "I told him no. I told him I didn't think so." "That's the right answer," I said. She turned and looked at me. In the dark I could see the pale of her face, the steadiness of it. "Thank you," she said, and then she went back inside before I could say anything foolish. The cold broke on the 14th of January. Not warm, not even close to warm, but the wind shifted south, and the temperature came up 20 degrees overnight, which is the difference between staying alive and not. I needed to get out to the south fence. I'd been putting it off since October, the shoulder giving me trouble, and with the cold on top of it, there'd been no good reason to push it. But I had 3 steers that kept finding their way through, and come spring when I tried to move cattle, I'd have a problem. Clara came out with me. Eli stayed in the house. She'd set him up with a pot and a wooden spoon, some game she'd invented involving an elaborate arrangement of dried beans, and she walked out to the south quarter with me in the cold, carrying the wire and the stretcher. She knew fence, she hadn't been exaggerating. She could find the weak spot by sight, could read the way the posts had heaved, knew without being told which staples needed replacing and which wire was stressed past the point of repair. We worked without much talking, which is the right way to work, and by midday we had a quarter-mile of line that would actually hold something. We stopped to eat. I'd brought bread and salt pork in my coat pocket, and she sat on a flat rock with her hands wrapped in her lap and looked out over the south pasture. "It's good land," she said. "It can be," I said. "This stretch doesn't get the water it should. You'd need to run a line off the creek." "I know it." Joel talked about doing something like that. A pause. He had ideas, she stopped. "He just didn't get the time," I said. She looked at me. "That's right, he didn't get the time." We ate the rest of it without talking. The sun was out, and it was cold and bright, and the snow on the south pasture had that particular hard glitter that means the melt is still a long way off. On the walk back, she said, without looking at me, "How long has it been since your wife?" 14 months, I said. She nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. I appreciated that. People saying they were sorry was a thing I'd had enough of. "What was her name?" "Margaret." Another long silence. Then, "She's in the ground here." "East corner against the fence." "Good place," she said. And it was. I'd thought that when I put her there, good son, and you could see the house. I hadn't told anybody that. I hadn't had anybody to tell. February came in quieter than January. Still cold, but manageable, the kind of cold you work in instead of hiding from. Clara had taken over the kitchen without making a production of it. I didn't know exactly when it happened. One morning I came in from the barn and breakfast was on the table, just there. And she was at the stove and Eli was on the floor building some architecture out of kindling wood. And it was so ordinary I had to stop in the doorway for a moment because ordinary was a thing I'd forgotten. She cooked the way she worked, direct, without fuss, and better than she needed to be. She made things out of nothing in particular, the way people learn to do when they've never had quite enough. What I ate in February was better than anything I'd eaten since Margaret, and I told her so once. And she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read, and then went back to what she was doing. She never asked for anything she hadn't earned. That was the thing I noticed first and kept noticing. Everything she took she'd accounted for. She kept a running tally in her head of every meal, every night's shelter, every piece of my firewood, and she paid it back in work. Fence and cooking and cleaning, and in the middle of February, when one of my horses came up with a bad foot, she was the one who figured out the problem and knew how to treat it. "You've done this before," I said, watching her. "Joel's horses were always getting into something," she said. She was working the foot methodically, no wasted motion. "He said I had a better touch than any vet he'd ever paid." He was right. She looked up at me briefly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. After the horse was done, she washed her hands at the pump, and the water was cold enough that her face went tight, and without thinking I picked up the rag and handed it to her. She took it, our fingers touched. Neither of us did anything about it. She'd been with me 6 weeks when Pete Donahue came out from Dorado. Pete ran the feed store and was one of those men who knew everything about everyone's business and felt it was his civic duty to make sure that fact was widely understood. I'd never liked him, but we'd done business, and he was the kind of man you did business with when there wasn't a choice. He came out on a Tuesday with a wagon of supplies I'd ordered in December and hadn't been able to get because of the weather. He tied up at the post and came to the door, and I let him in, and Clara was at the stove and Eli was at the table, and Pete took all of this in with the particular expression men like Pete get when they've found something worth reporting. He stayed longer than he needed to. He drank coffee I didn't offer him and asked questions he didn't need to ask, and the whole time he was watching Clara the way a man watches something he's already decided what to make of. When he finally got up to leave, he stopped at the door and said, "You know folks in town'll talk, Ed. Woman living out here no kin, no." "Pete," I said. He looked at me. "Go home." He went. I watched him up the lane until the wagon crested the rise and dropped out of sight. When I came back inside, Clara was at the stove exactly where she'd been. Not tense, not rattled, just working. But after a moment she said, without turning around, "He's not wrong. People will talk." "They'll talk anyway," I said. "That's what people do." "I don't want to cause you trouble." "Clara," I waited until she turned. "You came to my door in the dark in January with nowhere else to go. You've been working every day since. You've got a child and nowhere to put him, and the worst winter in 10 years outside the door. What kind of man would I be if I put you out because Pete Donahue has a mouth on him?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Not the kind I'd want to know," she said finally. "Right," I said, "so." She turned back to the stove, and that was the end of that particular conversation, though it wasn't the end of what it started. In March, the ground began to soften. Slow, grudging, this country doesn't let winter go easily, but by the second week there were bare patches in the south pasture and the creek was starting to move under its ice. I started thinking about spring seriously, calving first. I had 11 cows that would drop in April and I'd need to watch them close. Then the fence on the east line, which was worse than the south. Then planting. I kept a kitchen garden and a small corn patch, and I'd been thinking for years about expanding the corn if I could get the water right on the south quarter. One evening after dinner, Eli asleep, the fire down to good coals, I spread the rough map I'd made of the property on the table and started figuring the ditch line. I'd been working it out by memory, but I wanted to see it drawn. Clara came and looked over my shoulder. "That angle's wrong," she said after a minute. "How do you mean?" She pointed. "You'd want to come out of the creek here, not there. There's a drop you'd lose if you came out where you're showing." I looked at it. "You've been down the creek." "I walked it last week." A pause. "I hope that's all right." "Of course it's." I looked up at her. "When did you walk the whole creek?" "Tuesday." Eli was sleeping. "I wasn't." She hesitated. "I was thinking about what you said about the water. I wanted to understand the land." She said it simply, like it was obvious. Like, of course, she'd walked 2 miles of creek bottom in March mud because she wanted to understand the land. I looked back at the map. "Show me," I said. She sat down and picked up the pencil and drew the correction. Her hand was steady, and she knew what she was drawing. We worked on it for an hour. She knew things about that south quarter I'd missed in 20 years of owning it, because she'd looked at it with fresh eyes and thought about it hard. At some point I realized we'd been sitting with our heads close together over the paper for a long time, and neither of us had moved back. I didn't move back. She didn't either. After a while she said, very quietly, "Ed." "Yeah. I need to tell you something." "All right." She put the pencil down. She was looking at the paper. "I've been thinking about what happens in the spring when the roads open up, what I do." "I've been thinking about it too." She looked up. "What have you been thinking?" I'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I'd been turning it over in the dark at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, which was all of the dark at 3 in the morning. "I've been thinking," I said, "that you know this land better than some people who have been on it for years. And that Eli's going to need something to ride in the spring, and I've got a mare that's too gentle for cattle work, but would be just right for a child. And that the south quarter won't get the water it needs without somebody who knows where the drop in the creek is." She was watching me, not moving. "And I've been thinking," I said, That I've been alone for 14 months, and before that I was with Margaret, and I stopped, started again. I'm not a man who does this well, being alone. No, she said, I don't think you are. I'm 58 years old. I've got a bad shoulder and bad knees, and this place is more work than I can do alone. I know, she said. I looked at her. I'm not trying to offer you something small. I'm not trying to. Ed, she put her hand on the table, not on my hand. On the table, an inch from my hand. I came to your door in January, and you got up in the middle of the night in a coat over your long underwear, and you picked me up off the step without asking any questions. And you've asked nothing from me since that I haven't offered. I waited. That's not a small thing, she said. That's actually a very large thing. The fire cracked. Amos, shifted by the hearth, made a sound, went back to sleep. What are you saying? I asked. She looked at me for a long time. The same way she'd looked at me on the step in the dark, clear, steady, making an assessment and meaning it. I'm saying I'd like to stay, she said, if you're asking. I put my hand on hers. I'm asking, I said. We didn't talk much after that. Not that night. There was a kind of agreement in the quiet, something settled. And after a while she said good night and went to the back room where she and Eli slept, and I sat by the fire until it was out. I thought about Margaret. I want to be honest about that, too. I sat there and I thought about her, about what she'd think, about whether she'd find me foolish or maybe just lonely in the way she'd always been able to see right through to, even when I couldn't see it myself. I thought Margaret would have had opinions. She always had opinions. And I thought she'd probably have said, Ed, for God's sake, the woman walked 12 miles in January with a baby on her chest. Stop overthinking it. That sounds like something Margaret would have said. Spring came the way it does, not all at once, but sideways, incrementally more green than you noticed until you looked up one day and the world had changed. The mud season first, which is its own particular hell, and then the first real warm days where you could work without a coat, and then calving, which took everything I had and most of what Clara had too. She was there for every one of them. That's what I want to say about that. 11 calves, 2 of them difficult, 1 turned wrong and 1 from a first calf heifer who didn't know what she was doing, and Clara was there through both nights, calm and sure-handed and not wasting words. The turned calf I'd have lost without her. We were in the barn at 4 in the morning after the second hard one, both of us covered in what you get covered in when you've been pulling calves, and the heifer and her new calf were sorted out and resting, and Clara was washing her hands at the pump in the corner of the barn, and she was laughing. What? I said. Nothing, she said. Nothing, she was still laughing quietly, more to herself than to me. I was just thinking. Joel would have had ideas about this. He would have had opinions about the method. Was he wrong in his opinions? Often, she said. Not always. Sometimes he was entirely right and wouldn't stop talking about it for a week. She dried her hands on her pants because there was nothing cleaner available and looked at the heifer. She's going to be fine, Clara said. She is, I said. That calf too. She looked at me. Her hair had come out of its braids somewhere in the last 2 hours, and she had straw in it, and she was tired in the way you're tired after a fight you won, and she was still in the lamplight of my barn at 4 in the morning. There's no better word for it, beautiful. Not the way girls are beautiful. The way a person is beautiful when they're completely themselves. I don't know if I said anything. I might have said her name. She crossed the barn and put her head against my chest. Just that, not asking for anything, not making a drama of it. Just leaning in, and I put my arm around her carefully because of the shoulder, and we stood there in the smell of hay and new life while the heifer settled, and Amos, who'd followed us out on some instinct, lay down against the barn door with a groan. I'm going to fix that south quarter water this summer, I said. I know you are, she said. We figured out how. She'd said it without thinking. I don't think she noticed. I noticed. I want to tell you about the morning in May when Donahue came back. He brought 2 men from town this time. Officially, he was delivering a hardware order I'd placed. Unofficially, and Pete was never subtle about unofficially, he wanted to see how things stood. There'd been talk. He'd told someone who'd come out to tell me, serious talk, about a widow living on a man's property without benefit of. Well, I was at the corner of the barn when they came up the lane. Clara was in the garden. Eli was with her, or near her. He'd taken to following me in the mornings, but he'd gone to the garden after breakfast. Donahue saw me and raised his hand and started talking before he'd stopped the wagon. Something about the order, something about the weather, and then, "Good to see you've still got your house guest, Ed," folks were wondering. I let him get down from the wagon. "Pete," I said, "Clara Witt is my wife. We married in April." He stopped. "Reverend Hoskins came out," I said. "Clara's particular about things being done right." This was true. I'd asked her in March and she'd said yes, and she'd said one other thing, that she wasn't particular about much, but she was particular about this. And so Hoskins had made the ride out in early April. On the first day the road was decent, and we'd done it in the front room with Eli watching from the doorway with those serious, assessing eyes. After, Eli had come to stand in front of me and looked up at me for a long moment, and then he'd put his hand in mine. Just that, just put his hand in mine and stood there. Donahue didn't have anything to say. He unloaded the hardware order and left in something less than the time he'd arrived in. And as his wagon went up the lane, Clara came around the corner of the barn with dirt on her hands from the garden and Eli at her heels. "Was that Pete Donahue?" she said. "Yep." "What did he want?" "To know how things stood." She looked at me. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," I said, "how things stand." She looked up the lane where the dust from Pete's wagon was still settling. Then she looked back at me. "Good," she said. "That summer was hard work. Most summers are. We got the ditch line run off the creek. It took me and Eli and 2 hired men from Dorado 3 weeks, and Clara was right about where to come out of the bank, which I told her once, and she accepted without comment and didn't bring up again, which is its own kind of grace. The south pasture went green in July for the first time since I'd owned the place. I stood at the fence on the day the water first ran through and looked at it, and it was not what you'd call a dramatic moment. A field going green, that's all, the kind of thing a man who did everything right from the beginning might take for granted. But I hadn't done everything right from the beginning, and I hadn't had anyone to help me see what I was missing. And so it felt, standing there, like something I'd been owed for a while. Clara came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything. She'd seen the same field I'd seen in March, and she knew what it meant. I put my hand on her back. She leaned in slightly, just slightly. We stood there. The fall roundup that year was the best I'd had in 3 years. I sent 22 steers to market, up from 15 the year before, and they went in better condition because the pasture had been better, and because Clara had caught a sickness working through the herd in August and dealt with it before it spread. The price was decent, not what it had been in the good years, but not desperate either. And when I came back from Dorado with the payment, I put it on the table and sat down and looked at it for a while. Clara came and sat across from me. She looked at the money and then at me. "That's better than last year," she said. "It is." "Is it enough?" I thought about it. The fence still needed work on the east line. The barn roof had a section that worried me. I needed a new pump for the well before winter. "It's enough," I said. "We'll be careful, but it's enough." She nodded slowly. Something in her face relaxed that I hadn't known was tense. "Good," she said. "That's good, Ed." She said my name the way I'm not sure how to explain this. The way a person says a name when it belongs to them, when they've decided it belongs to them. Not careless, not too much, just claimed. Eli turned 5 in November. Clara made a cake out of what we had, which wasn't much in the way of cake-making supplies, but she made something and put 5 candles on it, and we ate it at dinner, and Eli blew the candles out with his eyes squeezed shut in the ferocious concentration children bring to wishing. "What did you wish for?" I asked him. He gave me the look, the same steady, assessing look he'd been giving me since January, since the morning he'd watched me mend the tack. "You're not supposed to say," he said. "Right," I said, "I forgot." He ate his cake, then he looked up at me. "I wished for a horse," he said. "The one in the barn, the one Mama said was too gentle for cattle work." "That's a good wish," I said. He considered. "I don't know if it'll come true." "I think it might," I said. "Some wishes come from the right place." He thought about this seriously, then he went back to his cake. Clara, across the table, was looking at me. I didn't look at her for a moment. I was looking at the boy, and when I did look up, she was still looking. And she had the expression she sometimes got that I'd come to think of as her accounting expression, the one where she was adding something up and deciding whether the sum was what she'd hoped. Whatever she was adding, the sum seemed to satisfy her. She picked up her fork and went back to her cake. The first snow came in December. Not the killing kind, 6 inches, gentle, more quiet than violent, and in the morning the world was the particular muffled white that makes even familiar ground look new. I was up before dawn, as always. I got the fire going and the coffee on, and I went out to check the stock. And coming back across the yard in the dark before the snow stopped, I looked at the house and saw lamplight in the kitchen window, which meant Clara was up. I stood in the yard for a moment. The snow was still coming down slow, and the lamp in the window made a yellow square in all that dark and white, and I could see her shadow moving in the kitchen, setting out cups, probably the way she did every morning. The small, reliable movements of a person going about a life they'd decided to go about. I thought about January, about what I'd heard through the wall, about lifting her off the step. I thought about a lot of things, standing in that yard in the snow in the dark before dawn. Then I went inside. She had the coffee poured. She looked up when I came in, the same direct look, and I stomped the snow off my boots and hung my coat, and she pushed the cup across the table toward me without being asked. I sat down. Eli was still asleep. The fire was going. Outside, the snow came down through the lamplight and the yard was white and quiet. "Everything good out there?" she said. "Everything's good," I said. She sat down across from me and wrapped her hands around her own cup. That was all. That was everything: the fire, the coffee, the lamp in the window, the woman across the table who'd walked 12 miles through killing cold with a child pressed against her chest, and knocked on my door in the dark and asked me not to leave her out there. And I hadn't, and she'd stayed. The snow came down outside. We drank our coffee. We were warm.